restoring data, and recovery tools. In this nugget, we'll take a look at how to restore data and also some other recovery options. Now, the restoring of data is just a continuation of what we started in the last nugget, which is where we were backing up data. Of course, you got to be able to restore that same data at some times. We'll also take a look at the various options from within NT Backup, and we'll also look at some command line function with NT Backup. Then we'll look at the storage management. Your removable media such as CD-ROMs, iOmega zip drives, tape especially, all have to be managed within storage management. We'll look at the various tools that are available and how to manipulate that. We'll also look at automated system recovery, which is another part of the backup utility, which basically allows you to recover an entire system using only a floppy disk, the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM, and the tape backup. We'll also take a look at the system state and how to back that up, and more importantly, how to restore something if something goes wrong. And we'll look at how to do that as an example with Active Directory data that's been deleted accidentally. We'll also take a look at the command console, which gives you a command line function for recovering a system. Now, when it comes to restoring data, you have to go ahead and access whichever item you wanted. In this case, for example, we used a file to create the backup. And that was just data home backup that we created earlier here. And this actually has a catalog that's been created and stored on the local drive. That makes it faster to retrieve actually which folders and files are involved in this backup. That's going to be especially important when it comes to tape. And again, I know I'm getting down on tape a lot, but really, especially with a single drive, it's extremely slow. Again, however, if you have robotic libraries in your larger organization, it might not be so burdensome. But the catalog data is stored in the actual backup file itself or on the actual tape itself, and it's stored on the local hard drive here. And that way we have, if we want to use it from the local hard drive, it's going to be much faster than retrieving it from tape, for example. If you import foreign media, for example, I bring in a tape from another machine where the backup was not originally made on this machine, then it can retrieve the catalog from that tape and then copy it to this local hard drive. In that case, let's go ahead and take a look at the catalog. The catalog is really telling me exactly what it has in the backup. All the fact that I can see all of this stuff is simply because I have a catalog. If you don't have a catalog for a backup that you've created previously, again, this can even be a backup file that I've copied over to this machine. You can go to Tools and then Catalog a Backup File. And then if I had a tape in there, I could go to Media Tools, and there's an option under Media Tools, which is grayed out right now, to also catalog that tape. And then when I want to restore the data, I simply check whichever piece of data it is that I want to restore, and I can restore files to the original location, an alternate location, which would just send it to a different folder, but it would retain all of the folder structure. Or I could do a single folder, which would not retain the folder structure, and I would just designate wherever I wanted it to go down here. It would not retain the folder structure, so it would just plop merger details, in this case, right into the root of C. Or if I had chosen alternate location and gone to drive C, then it would put on that drive C, home, Phoenix User 01, and then this file inside of the folder. So then we simply click on Start Restore and click OK to start restoring. It will mount the media that we're using, which is just a file for the backup, and then it'll restore the data, and that went pretty quick because we only had a single file. Again, of course, we can choose Report. If we had any problems with it, we could just look at this report, and then that's pretty much it. Just click on Close, and we've got our files back. Now, there's several options that are available under Tools and Options, and you can use these to configure the way the backup, restore, and general operations work. Here, for example, the Compute Selection Information Before Backup and Restore Operations, you can deselect this item, and that means that it will just not show you how many files it's going to back up, how long it might take to do the backup or restore operation, and things of this nature. You normally will use the catalogs on media to speed building up or store catalogs on disk. This especially is the case if you don't have a catalog on disk, and you're importing tape from another machine that was made on another backup machine. Now, the only time you would really deselect this item is if you're missing a tape out of the set, and you really can't rebuild the whole catalog using the catalog on media because you're missing one of the tapes. So with this, you would deselect it and then scan all of the tapes. This could take many, many hours, so be prepared for that. But you might have to do it if you're missing a tape. The verified data after the backup completes explains itself, I think. Back up the contents of mounted drives. This is important because, you know, we talked earlier in this series about having an empty folder that you link to or mount to a mounted drive, which would be another volume that you create. And that way, you can access the same drive letter, but you actually access additional partition space on a different partition. Well, if you clear this item, then it only backs up the fact that there is a folder there. You will see a folder, but it will not back up whatever is inside of that folder, which is actually a mounted drive. Now these next checkboxes relate to removable storage, and this is what manages things like your tapes as you bring them in. So if I bring a tape from another machine and it's unrecognizable, then it will identify it as unrecognizable, and then at that point I can import it or I can allocate it to what's called a free pool, which makes it available for use, and so forth. And that's what all these are relating to, and if the removable storage item service is not running, then that could have an impact on how I bring those tapes in, so I'd want to know if it wasn't running properly. And then you can also set it up so that it'll give you an alert message if there's recognizable media available, and this really relates to any new media or imported media. This will also show you if it's new media, whereas this one will simply show it to you if it's in the import pool. And then finally, this last item would allow you to always use new media for backup purposes instead of remote storage management. Now, in the Restore tab, we configure what happens if a file already exists on the hard drive and you're restoring the same file from tape, or from any backup. If it's already on the disk, then you can just specify, do not replace the file on my computer. And this would be useful for replacing files that are simply missing. You can also replace the file on disk only if the file on disk is older, and that would be useful for restoring versions of files that were accidentally replaced with an older version, for example. And then finally, this will just always replace the files on your computer. And it only replaces files that are already on your computer. So if there's any files that are on your computer that are not in the backup, then they will, of course, will also remain. Now here we specify what to do if you're restoring a file that already exists on the computer. You can just not replace the file on the computer, and that would be useful if you're simply missing files. You can also replace the file on disk only if the file on disk is older. And then finally, you can always replace the file on your computer. Any files that are already on the system that are not in the tape will still remain, but of course anything that's on the tape and on the hard drive will be replaced by whatever's on the tape or the backup. The backup type, you can just designate which type to backup. We've already discussed all these types. These are the default backup types. You can change any of these, however, when you actually make a backup. And then for the backup log, it just identifies whether you want a detail, the summary, or no log at all. Normally it's a summary by default. And then you can exclude certain files. For example, you don't want to back up the Power Management Hibernate file, because that's just a file that's the same size as your RAM. On this system, I got a gigabyte of RAM, so I wouldn't want to back up a gigabyte hiberfile.sys. And similarly with the page file, and then there are other kinds of temporary files and other files that you would pretty much never want to back up. You could select one of these if you felt that it was actually important and then remove it, but that probably would not be wise in most of the cases here because they're selected for this. And then you can also add additional files that you want to be excluded for this individual user, whereas this one relates to all users. Now switching over here to computer management, we can go to the storage item and then to removable storage, and this will relate to removable media such as CD-ROM, iOmega Jazz drives, those kinds of things, and particularly tape. In this case, for example, if I click on media, it identifies that I have a Traven tape located in the Traven drive right at this point, the Seagate drive. And if we go to the media pools, then we see some important issues regarding how to manage these pools. You see, when you insert a tape into a drive, it has to be designated as one of these kinds of items in the media pool. If I insert, for example, a completely blank or a tape from a foreign format, then it's going to go into the unrecognized pool. And we see that we'd go back down to Traven here, and I don't have any unrecognized media. But if I did, it would show up over here. Now, if it's blank tape, I would have to first format it to make it available for use, and then, if it's not already pre-formatted, then I could put it into the free pool right here. Now, the thing important to know about that is you cannot use a tape using the backup utility unless it is in the free media pool. Then once I've actually used a tape and it's in the free media pool and I'm making a backup, for example, to this one, and I've already freed this one up so it's in here, then once I've made a backup to that tape, it would then move to the backup media pool, and then we'd see a list of tapes or other media depending on your interface in this interface. Finally, if I bring in a tape that was actually made on a different tape drive on a different machine, then it would appear in the import pool, and it would appear right here. And all I have to really do in this case is to retrieve the catalog off of the tape using the backup utility, and once I've retrieved the catalog off that tape, it moves it automatically from the import pool down to the backup pool. Also note that all of the tapes that you use in this system must have a unique label, and that's because of the way that they're associated with the catalog files. So if I have two tapes with the exact same name, then the system will kind of be confused and not know which catalog file to associate it with. Now also note that within any of these items here, any of these pools, you can right-click on a tape and choose to free it. and if you do that, that effectively also erases it. It's not a secure erase. For that, you're going to probably need third-party utilities, because even a format, which you can do from within the backup utility, does not actually erase the data securely. However, like I said, if you take a tape, and here I've got one in the free pool, but it will still allow me to do this. You can just right-click on any tape and then choose Free, and it says, are you sure you want to do that? It destroys the data on the media. I don't know if you want to say, I think that's a little overstated. It's still retrievable if you have the right tools and the inclination and the time. But anyway, it will just destroy it effectively from the interface. There's no easy way to get to it. If you want to move it to the free pool, so click on yes. Are you sure you want to destroy the data? Yes. And then it will move it to the free pool where you see this tape right now. Now also, for every backup that you create, it does create a backup log in this location under Documents and Settings, whoever the user is, Local Settings, Application Data, Microsoft, Windows NT, NT Backup, and then Data. Boy, I need to take a deep breath after that. I think Microsoft tries to bury this as deep as possible for some reason or another. Anyway, this is where they all are. There's no way to change the location of where they go, and you can't change the number outside of 10. It's 10 by default. That's all there is. As soon as you back up an 11th backup, it'll just overwrite the oldest of these logs. Now you can see up here that I've got NT backup from a command line, and you do NT backup space, and then followed by the word backup. If you just type NT backup and enter, it'll open up the GUI backup, which is not what I'm looking for here. This would be useful if I had it in a script and I wanted to run it specifically that way. And what you do then is you identify which share you want to back up. You can also enter a local path if that's what you're trying to back up. Enclose everything in quotation marks here, and you see all these will be enclosed in quote marks. And then the /J is the name of the job. That'll be just home backup in my case. /F for the file location, quote, and then again the name of the backup file and the location, close quote. Then you press enter. You see that it just goes to town and backs up instantly. Bam, it's pretty quick. Done. So that's how it runs from the command line. Now also note that if you want to see other switches that you can use for this, for example, how to back up to tape and all that, there's a whole bunch of them. And you can just do an NT backup space / question mark. That opens up a help file for NT backup, showing you all of the command line parameters. Also, NT backup only backs up from the command line. From the command line, it does not restore, so be aware of that. Now let's move on to another topic, and that is automated system recovery. Now don't confuse this with Windows XP's System Restore. XP's System Restore is a periodic backup of things like the registry, profile, other critical system settings on your system. It allows you to kind of roll back to a previous version of Windows, and it's useful if you've installed new drivers or new applications that have caused the system to blow up and you can roll back. Well, ASR is not that same thing, so again, don't confuse it. Automated System Recovery uses the backup utility to create a backup of primarily the system and boot partition, which are normally, your drive C, because normally we don't split those up. In any case, it backs up that information, and it backs up the volume information about what size drives you had, how many volumes were involved, and that kind of thing. It uses a floppy disk to configure that information, to retain that information, as well as a floppy disk to identify which files were involved in the system. Now, there's two ways of doing an ASR backup. You can use the wizard right at the beginning of the backup utility, or you can use the advanced mode. If you use the wizard, it also backs up any additional volumes you have. Well, and we'll just call that collectively data. So I've got a drive C with system and boot partition. I've got a data drive D with my home directory on it, for example. The wizard would do both of these. The advanced mode would only do this first one. However, both of them do create that floppy disk which contains configuration information on it, and what you need to use in order to restore your ASR backup. And the purpose of ASR is catastrophic system failure, where, we've had a machine just totally blow up and smoke is pouring out of it and everything like that. But we want the machine back, so we buy a brand new machine, brand new hard drives. We can use our backup with ASR and the floppy disk in conjunction with the Windows Server 2003 CD-ROM to pretty much rebuild the whole machine. It's almost like restoring an image. It's not quite as sophisticated as that, but the end result is just about the same. Now, to actually run that ASR backup, you simply go back to your backup utility, and once it launches, you start again with the wizard by default. Now, here's a critical difference. This is what I was talking about earlier. If I just next, and backup files and settings, and next, and all information on this computer, this is actually the ASR backup that it's going to create. And then I can just next, finish to finish everything here. Now, if I go back here to the advanced mode and then click this button down here for the automated system recovery wizard, then it will only include the boot system volume, but not any additional volumes for data and so forth. And then I would just next finish through this, and again, the same thing would take place. It would just back everything up, except that it would not back up additional volumes, like I said. Now, when it comes to restoring from ASR, then all you have to do is these steps. By the way, I don't know why they call it automated system recovery, because there's nothing automated about it. You manually back up everything, and you manually restore it. So I don't know why they call it automated. Anyway, you have your backup available. We'll just assume it's a tape, and then you'll insert the floppy disk that was created originally. Now, the floppy disk contains two files, asr.sif and asrpnp.sif, and these contain a catalog of all the files that were on the system. And, of course, the ASR wizard will also include configuration about your disk configuration. It also includes a system state backup and a backup of all the files included in the driver cache. And we discussed that earlier in a previous nugget, but that would normally be your driver.cab files. In any case, going back to this floppy, if you've lost it, or if it's corrupt, as is often the case with floppies where they're unreadable and all that kind of thing, then you can use the ASR backup to restore only the Windows repair folder. And in that Windows repair folder, which you can restore to any other machine, then copy manually asr.sif and asrpnp.sif to another floppy, and then you're back in business. Because there's no special formatting with the floppy as long as it's normally formatted. Then you simply boot from the CD with the floppy and the disk and the backup available. Early in the boot process, you'll see an F2 message to use an ASR. And then once you do that, what it's going to do is to reconfigure the drives according to the original configuration. You do have to use drives of the same size or larger than the original system. So even if you didn't use all of the available hard drive in the original system, and the new drives are smaller but are large enough to contain everything, that's not good enough. Have to be as large or larger. And then it just copies the files from the CD-ROM, and then it restores files from tape, and you're pretty much back in business at this point. Now, we don't discuss Active Directory in a lot of depth in this particular series like we do in certain others, but let me just point out that Active Directory uses a file called ntds.dit. And if we go into the file system and look for that, we just go to our drive C, then I can go to Windows, then I'll go down here to ntds, and then I see that there's an ntds.dit file. This is where the actual Active Directory information is stored, so that if I go to, for example, Active Directory users and computers, all these Active Directory users and computers that I see in this, all the organizational units, and all the other characteristics of Active Directory are actually stored in this file right here. So, of course, you would understand that that's a critical file that we absolutely must protect. Now, this domain controller that I'm working with right now, DC Nugget 1, does also have another domain controller within our topology here, so it replicates back and forth with DC Nugget 2. So I've got two copies of ntds.dit, one on this domain controller, DC Nugget 1, another one on DC Nugget 2. Now, what I should do is to regularly back up, going back to our backup utility here and going into the advanced mode, I should regularly back up what's known as the system state. And if you scroll down here, you'll see that you have a system state item. And by selecting that, it identifies exactly what I have within the system state. And let's discuss what each one of these things are. First of all, there's just Active Directory, which is obvious. That's pretty much that ntds.dit file and some associated files there that help me to reconstruct Active Directory if something ever goes wrong. There's also the boot files, like my boot ini file, ntloader, those kinds of things. And then there's the COM+ class registration that allows me to share things like DLLs among multiple applications, the registry, and then there's the sysvol, which stores things such as our policies and other kinds of scripts that we want to replicate back and forth between domain controllers. Now, depending on the role of this particular server, you may also have additional services that it's going to back up. It could also back up a certificate services database if I happen to be a certificate server here. It can also back up any cluster service information if this were also a clustering server. Also, it doesn't show it directly here, but it will also back up my IIS metabase if this is an IIS server, and it is, so it will back that information up as well. Now, then also be aware of the fact that if I decide to do my system state and I go up here and I say, you know what, I think I'll also back up my home directory, but I only want this to be an incremental backup. Well, I could go ahead and start backup, and then I would next finish through the wizard, and I would select incremental backup. But anytime that you select a system state, it automatically kicks it back over to a copy version instead. So the backup type will be copy instead of an incremental, and it will not give you that indication in the interface. Just be aware of that, because it might throw off your other backups since it's not going to clear the archive bit. Now, I've already created a system state backup over on DC Nugget 2, and we'll work with that in a little while here. But first, let's talk about the two kinds of restores we can work with. We have a non-authoritative and an authoritative restore. The non-authoritative restore will require me to go to Directory Services Restore mode, and for that, I'll simply press F8 on the keyboard right during the startup process. You might have to press it a couple of times because it doesn't give you any kind of a notification there that when you're supposed to press F8. So just keep hammering on F8. Eventually, you'll get to a boot menu, and you can choose Directory Services Restore mode, and then you simply use NT Backup to restore the system state. Then, what is this non-authoritative restore useful for? Well, if I've got a domain controller that's just got a corrupt Active Directory, there's problems with the file, it doesn't seem to replicate properly, has some other problems, as long as it's not something that's a corruption that's replicated in other domain controllers, then what I would do is to restore just this domain controller using a non-authoritative restore, and it would give me back a basic Active Directory infrastructure. Then at that point, once I reboot the server, replication for my other known good domain controllers will overwrite the data from this domain controller, and I'll pretty much be back in business. Now, the other kind of restore that we can use is an authoritative system state restore, and what this will do is it will increment the property version number, and we'll see this. I'll show you a little tool in a little while that will show you that incrementation, and it'll increment that PVN by 100,000. What's the purpose for that? Well, you see what happens now with an authoritative restore is that not only does it restore the base of Active Directory, but it makes the data that I've restored from the tape there authoritative, so that when replication takes place, the other domain controllers know whether or not to overwrite this data by looking at the property version number. And if their number is lower, let's say their number is only 1,100, then they'll say, oh, well, this domain controller's data is more current. And then what's going to happen is this domain controller's data will overwrite all of the other domain controllers. And that's most useful if I've had a mistake happen, such as, I've had an administrator delete an entire organizational unit or something. Well, then I would do an authoritative restore because it would increment that organizational unit with all of its contents and force it to be copied back to all the other domain controllers. Otherwise, if I had just chosen a non-authoritative restore after having deleted an OU, then what would happen is this would be an old backup that I'd restored here, so its property version number might be lower, might be, 900, something like that. It's supposed to be a 9. And then now in this case, the other domain controllers would say, oh, hey, well, my property version number is more recent than yours, so I'm going to overwrite and stomp on what you've got, and then we're going to delete your organizational unit. So you get in this little circle here that's no fun whatsoever. That's the purpose of an authoritative restore, however, to give us that 100,000 to make sure that we get to override everybody else's domain controllers. Now, when you get into this, you do your restore the same way that you do in a non-authoritative restore using NT Backup. Then, however, you go to a command prompt and run ntdsutil, and then you type in authoritative restore, which takes you to a special command prompt. You can type in then restore database, which restores all of Active Directory and increments everything by 100,000. Or you can do restore subtree, as in the case of, for example, an organizational unit, and then you enter in the distinguished name of the organizational unit you want to restore, and it just does that one, and increments only that OU by 100,000 and all of its contents. Now here I'm going to run a utility called replimon, and this is simply a tool that's included with Windows Server 2003 that allows me to monitor servers, so I'll add a monitor server by right-clicking on this. And my objective here is not to teach you this whole tool. My objective is only to show you the property version number. And I'm just going to add the name of the server I'm looking for, DC Nugget 1, and then I'll enter this in. Now, once I've got that open, what I want to do is to right-click on DC Nugget 1 and show attribute metadata. That's going to show me the property version number for my existing organizational unit, for example. So I'll click OK here to use my existing credentials, and I'm going to have a location of, how about my Phoenix OU. So I open up the Phoenix OU. My property version number is all like 1 and 2. So that means there's only been 1 or 2 changes. The 1 is what happens when it's initially created, and 2 would occur if there had been a minor change to, or any kind of a change made to the OU at some time. Okay, so I've only got low version numbers. Now, just keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll close this all out. And then what we're going to do is a big mistake. Something that hopefully never happens to you. And what we've got going on here is we've got somebody in the office, another administrator, and they go to administrative tools and Active Directory users and computers, and they're fiddling around with different stuff, and they're saying, okay, somebody wanted me to go into Phoenix and rename that to Phoenix Administrators, so I'm going to right-click here, go down to Rename. Are you sure you want to rename? What is all of this about? Oops. Oh, no, I didn't rename it, I just deleted the thing. Oh, crying out loud, I'm going to get fired. Well, what are you going to do now? You're going to use your authoritative restore, and you're going to use it real fast, believe me. And you see, what's going to happen now is it's going to replicate within just minutes to all of your other domain controllers. Now, there are ways of trying to stop that, but it's very difficult, and it's much easier just to use an authoritative system restore. Otherwise, trying to stop replication from happening manually is going to be kind of like trying to change a tire on a moving vehicle. So we're going to go ahead and use an authoritative system restore. So now after our little mishap here, we've booted into Directory Services Restore mode, which both does not use the network and does not use Active Directory. Therefore, it's not locked open, and that allows us then to manipulate Active Directory in using an authoritative or non-authoritative Directory Services Restore. So let's go ahead and take a look then at what we can do with this. Now, first of all, we'll just go back to our All Programs, we'll go to Accessories, we'll go to our System Tools, and Windows Backup. So we'll go to the Backup Utility, and then what we're going to do is to go back to our Advanced Mode, and this time we will restore a backup that we created earlier. There's a record of our previous backup for our system state, and we'll back this up. By the way, let me point out that even during a backup and a restore, you cannot individually select or deselect the various components of the system state. It's all or nothing for the system state. That's because there's interdependencies with all of those items. And I'll simply just restore everything to the original location. So now I'll click on Start Restore and click OK. Then when we get to this, we'll just click OK again to start the restoration process, and hopefully everything will come back just fine. And here we have a message locating the actual backup file. That is the right backup file, so I'll just click OK. Now it's going to go ahead and mount the media, and in a moment we'll start doing the restore. It does take a little while, so I'll see you on the other side of this. And then we see that the restore is completed, so we'll simply close this, and we'll be able to go back in now. And now, here's an important thing to note. It says, do you want to restart your computer now? Reflexively, it's really easy to just say, oh, click yes. Well, remember, clicking yes is what got us into this trouble in the first place when we deleted that organizational unit. And actually, clicking yes would be okay if we wanted to do a non-authoritative restore. However, since it's an authoritative restore, we must click no instead, and then we can get out of this. We don't need backup anymore. Now, the reason why we clicked no is because we still have to go to a command prompt to run ntdsutil from within this. And in fact, if we had accidentally clicked on yes, it would have been okay, but you just have to reboot back into Directory Services Restore mode and start this thing over again, and then you go into a command prompt here to start ntdsutil. So you're going to save yourself some time. So we'll go back now to go to a command prompt, and then from the command prompt, you can simply type in ntdsutil, dsutil. And once you press enter here, it takes you to the ntdsutil command prompt. Now, what we want to do is to do an authoritative restore. And you can type in the whole words authoritative space restore, but just typing in the first part of it kind of figures out the rest of what you want to do here. And if I wanted to restore all of Active Directory, maybe the entire thing got totally messed up, then I could just type in restore database, and that would restore everything for us entirely. In our case, however, I want to restore a subtree. Type in my distinguished name, OU equals Phoenix. Domain component equals Nugget Lab, domain component equals com, and press enter. And it says, are you sure you want to perform this authoritative restore? Of course I am in this case, I'm pretty sure. So I'll click on yes, and I've got a lot more confidence when I click on yes here than I did when I originally deleted that OU. Now it's going to open up the Directory Information Tree database. That's the ntdirectoryservices.dit, Directory Information Tree database file. And now it's going to start to increment that Directory Information Tree database. And indeed, we see that it has incremented. It increased the attribute version numbers by 100,000, so that's exactly what we wanted. Now when we're done, simply quit everything out here. Quit, I guess I should type quit instead of exit. There we go. And then now we can just restart this computer, at which point we'll be back in business for our domain, and we'll retrieve then our Phoenix organizational unit. And now returning here to a normal boot for Windows Server 2003 domain controller, I'm going to do a rep admin sync all, and this is going to synchronize between all of my domain controllers, and it looks like we have no errors, so I'm going to exit out of this, and then we're going to go back into Active Directory users and computers, and first of all, see if we can find that OU that we lost. Now let's go back to Active Directory users and computers and look up into this, and do we have our Phoenix OU back, please, please? Oh, there it is! Yay, we got everybody back, we got a little computer, our groups, all our users. Everything looks pretty good. Now I can right-click on this and rename it appropriately. So I go down here and I click on I know what you're thinking. James, don't click on delete, you fool. You'll do this whole thing over again. No, then I can just click rename and rename it to whatever we wanted to rename it. Then let's also go back and look at Active Directory Replication Monitor where we were earlier. And again, we'll look at the attribute metadata, and we'll look at the Phoenix OU, and then click OK. And notice that now, indeed, it has incremented by 100,000 to make it an authoritative restore. Well, the recovery console is another excellent utility, another method for doing disaster recovery, especially for a system that cannot boot properly into Windows. And since it can't get into Windows, you can't get into any tools there to manage the system and to troubleshoot stuff. And especially if it won't even go into safe mode, well, probably going to need to use the recovery console. And you can access the recovery console one of two ways. Number one, you can use WinNT32 to install it. Number two, if you didn't have a chance to install it, you can just boot off of the CD-ROM, and then as a repair option, you can use the recovery console. Now, if you do use WinNT32, just access the source files, wherever those are, and then /cmdcons, and that'll install the recovery console as a boot option, and it will copy the recovery console's files to the local hard drive. Otherwise, you'll just run them off the CD-ROM, as I mentioned a moment ago. Now, of the various commands that are available, there's several of them available, but we'll give you the highlights for some of the key ones. One of those is the list service item that you can run from the recovery console. Now, to get to the recovery console after you've booted to it, it'll also prompt you with which installation of Windows you want to use. Most systems there will be only one, so you'll type in the number 1 and press enter. Then you enter in the local administrator credentials. In any case, then we can run list service that will identify any services or drivers that are set to start up with the system. Now, if I identify one that's causing a problem, it's hanging the system up or it's blue screening the system, then I could go to another command and I type in disable followed by the name of the service or driver that I see listed under list service. So that's a very useful way of helping the machine to boot up if I've installed a driver or a service that's causing a problem. I can also use disk part. That allows me to, create, delete partitions. And after I've created a partition, for example, then I can use the format command, which is also in the recovery console, to format that drive. You can also use bootcfg to manage your startup menu so that you can reconfigure that if necessary. And then you can use fixboot. This will write a new partition boot sector onto the system partition, and it will help you get back in business if you've had troubles with booting up properly from that system partition. Or you can reconfigure and recreate, actually, the master boot record for the partition boot sector. Of course, these are both very useful in systems that will not boot because of damage to the boot or master boot record. Now, once you're in the recovery console, you can always copy data to the drive, to the recovery console's drive. However, you cannot recover data or copy data from the local drive to removable media such as a floppy disk or something like that. If you don't want that behavior, then you can go to this option, which is under Computer Configuration Windows Settings, Security Settings, and then you go to Local Policies and Security Options. Make your way down to the Recovery Console item here to enable this policy. That would allow you to copy files to a floppy, and then it would also allow you to access all drives and folders, because you see, otherwise, with the normal default recovery console, you can only access the command console folder, and that's cmdcons, and that's at the root of the drive, and the Windows directory, and that's all you can access. And that is kind of a halfway security measure to prevent someone from accessing other sensitive data on that same local drive. Also, you cannot use wildcards by default, so you can't use, delete star.star or something like that, and that's just, again, a precaution to help you to prevent from deleting too much, I guess. So if you're in the recovery console, then you can go to your command prompt, which is what you're going to be in a command console anyway, and you can adjust some of these behaviors from the command line there as well. For example, if you wanted to allow all paths to be browsed, then you could do a set space, and then you could do allow all paths, and then space equals space. Don't forget the spaces on either side of the equal line there, and then true. And then that would allow you to access all the paths from within the recovery console. Then the other thing you could do is to set allow removable media, which would again allow you to copy files from the hard drive to a disk, and that would be another set parameter that you could enter in from the command console. And then finally, you could do the wildcards, which is what I just mentioned, set allow wildcards with this syntax, and true for that as well. And then you could use wildcards to search for or delete files, for example. Now then later on, if you want to remove the recovery console for any reason, you can do a number of different things with this. First of all, make sure that you go to Tools, Folder Options, and then you can view super hidden files. To do that, you go to View, and then I've already enabled it on this item, but deselect this checkbox for Hide Protected Operating System Files, also known as super hidden files. These are hidden files that are also system files. And once you've done that, go to the drive and see this command console folder, that actually contains all of the commands and everything we need for the recovery console. So just delete this entire folder. And then once you've done that, you'll also want to go to your system properties. Well, I usually do that by right-clicking my computer and choosing properties. And then going to advanced, startup and recovery settings, and then edit the default operating system item here. Click on edit here to open up the boot INI file. Next thing you want to do is to remove the line relating to the command console. So in this case, I would delete this whole line right here. In this nugget, we picked up where we left off in our last nugget, where we were backing up data. And in this nugget, we continued by restoring the data, and then we look at some other recovery tools as well. When we restored the data, we saw how that's performed. We also see that you can look at various options from within the backup utility, as well as using it from a command line. Now, you need to know how to manage the removable media, so we looked at the removable storage portion of the computer management console. And within that, you have several pools that you can work with, and we saw how to make those available and manipulate those as well. We looked at automated system recovery, which is a great way to recover an entire system. And we also looked at the system state, which, as we saw, is a great way to recover accidentally deleted Active Directory data. We also looked at the command console, which is a way to manage recovery from a command line function if you cannot boot into Windows properly. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.